The proximity alarm screamed, "Breach in Sector 7." Something was drifting toward Kepler Station that looked nothing like human technology. Its surface shifted between blues and purples, too organic for military vessels. Marcus Chen faced an impossible choice: follow Houston's orders to maintain distance, or venture toward the unknown craft that could either destroy them or unlock unimaginable knowledge. Marcus Chen's morning coffee was a ritual of isolation, a habit carved from the quiet hum of machinery and recycled air. The brew tasted like metal and routine, a flavor he'd come to recognize as the taste of distance. He held the warm mug in both hands, looking out at the star-dusted black. For 73 mornings straight, he'd done this. No variation, no surprises. Then the klaxons tore through the station's artificial calm. The sound wasn't just loud, it was invasive. A shrieking pulse that bypassed the ears and went straight for the spine. The alert screen on the bulkhead wall flashed to life, painting his face in brutal red light. 2 words repeated in blocky capitals: "Proximity breach, Sector 7." This wasn't the usual sensor ghost or a chunk of orbital debris the system sometimes flagged. The confidence rating glowed beside the alert, 99.8%. That kind of certainty only happened when the object was real, solid and moving under controlled motion. His hand froze mid-sip. Steam coiled up from the mug like a fragile ghost, the last trace of a morning that had just ended. Around him, the station's ambient sounds shifted. The low thrum of life support, the faint hiss of climate control. All of it was suddenly background noise to the alarm's relentless beat. His training kicked in before his mind could fully process it. Muscle memory sent his free hand toward the console, pulling up the external sensor feed. No visual yet. Just radar returns and thermal signatures that didn't align with any known vessel class. Too smooth. Too quiet. He set his coffee down. The ceramic clinked against the metal desk. Too small a sound in the new cacophony. He remembered the last proximity alert, 3 months back. A satellite fragment tumbling end over end, harmless once identified. This felt different. The system doesn't hit 99.8% on debris. That number means it knows what it's looking at, even if he doesn't. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen, waiting for the visual to resolve. The steam from his coffee had already vanished, absorbed back into the dry, processed air. A tiny cloud of normalcy, gone. Whatever was coming, it wasn't asking permission. The monitor flickered, then stabilized. The visual feed resolved into something that shouldn't exist. Its surface flowed like liquid obsidian under starlight, a constantly shifting tapestry of deep indigo and electric violet. No sharp edges, no fixed shape. It seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a visual paradox that strained the eyes. The object maintained a rough oval form, yet its boundaries appeared to breathe, subtly expanding and contracting in a rhythm that felt more biological than mechanical. Marcus scanned for standard features: thruster ports, sensor arrays, communication dishes. Nothing. The surface remained unbroken, a seamless continuum that defied manufacturing logic. Human ships bore the scars of construction: welds, seams, bolt patterns. This thing showed none of that. It looked grown rather than built, like a single piece of polished stone shaped by millennia of water. He tapped commands into his console, pulling up the military database. The system cycled through known vessel classes: Alliance cruisers, Martian patrol ships, corporate exploration models. Each comparison returned a mismatch percentage climbing into the 90s. The identification software finally timed out with a flat declaration: no match found. His training manuals contained protocols for first contact scenarios, but they all assumed something recognizable: a ship, a probe, something with visible means of propulsion and purpose. This was different. The object drifted without apparent thrust, maintaining a steady approach vector that felt too precise for random motion. No heat signature beyond ambient space temperature. No energy readings. No electromagnetic emissions. It moved with the quiet certainty of a predator that knows it's being watched. Marcus zoomed the visual feed to maximum resolution. The surface details emerged as fractal patterns that swam just beneath the shimmering exterior, like thoughts moving behind closed eyes. They swirled in complex formations that suggested intelligence behind the motion, not random particle behavior. The patterns reacted to his scanning, When he switched to infrared, the swirls intensified briefly before settling into a new configuration. He checked the distance. 800 meters and closing at a steady 5 meters per second. No deviation, no response to his automated hails. The silence felt heavier than vacuum, more deliberate than mere absence of sound. This was what the military theorists called an unknown unknown, not just something they couldn't identify, but something they hadn't even imagined could exist. The textbook said to treat such encounters as maximum threat scenarios, but the object's gentle drift and lack of defensive posture suggested either profound peacefulness or a confidence so absolute it didn't need defensive postures. Marcus watched the way starlight played across its surface, how the colors shifted from deep ocean blue to nebula purple without transition. Human technology couldn't do that. Human understanding couldn't explain it. He found himself leaning closer to the screen, not in fear but in pure, undiluted curiosity. The thing had a kind of beauty that felt older than ships, older than stations, older perhaps than humanity itself. It just kept drifting closer, silent as thought, patient as gravity. The comm link to Earth crackled to life, a sudden intrusion of human noise into the profound silence of the encounter. Mission Control's response came through crisp and clinical, stripped of all emotional residue. The voice belonged to Director Harrison, or one of his deputies, it didn't matter. The tone carried the same institutional weight. Kepler Station, maintain safe distance. Do not engage. Await further instructions. The words arrived with the clear, uncompromising certainty of someone observing from 1.2 billion kilometers away, where the light delay meant every decision was already 13 minutes outdated by the time it was heard. Marcus kept his eyes locked on the main screen. The alien craft continued its slow, deliberate rotation, a ballet of dark matter and impossible light. Every instinct he'd honed over 20 years of service screamed that protocol was designed for human threats, territorial disputes, rogue corporations, maybe the occasional salvager pushing boundaries. It assumed recognizable motives, predictable behaviors. This thing defied categorization on every level. Its silence didn't feel hostile. It felt observant. The lack of weapons, the absence of aggressive maneuvering, the gentle way it held its position, it all pointed towards something far more complex than a simple threat scenario. He watched the craft complete one full rotation. The surface patterns shifted subtly, like ink dispersing in water. No response to Houston's transmission. No reaction to the station's presence at all. It simply existed, a calm, silent witness to his mounting dilemma. Protocol was clear. Orders were explicit, but protocol was written for known physics, known psychology. This was something else entirely, a second rotation. The distance between them felt both vast and intimate. He could almost sense the sheer otherness of it, a consciousness so alien that human concepts of conflict might be irrelevant. What if caution was the wrong choice? What if this was a test and retreat would be misinterpreted as fear or hostility? The military databases offered no guidance for first contact with a being that might not even recognize violence as a concept. Third rotation. His hand settled on the thruster control panel. The plastic felt cool and familiar under his fingertips. This was the moment where training clashed with instinct, where the voice of Earth-based command met the reality unfolding outside his viewport. Harrison's orders were still echoing in the comm system, a loop of caution and control. But the alien craft just kept turning, silent, patient, utterly unconcerned with human protocols. The silence from the vessel wasn't empty. It was full of potential. It felt less like a warning and more like a question waiting to be answered. His thumb rested on the manual override. The system chimed a soft warning, reminding him of the safety margin he was about to violate. He ignored it. The sound of his own breathing filled his helmet steady and clear. Out there, something unknown waited, and sometimes the only way to understand the question is to move closer to the source. His fingers remembered the drills. 3 steps: identify, assess, retreat. Muscle memory from 20 years of service had carved those pathways deep. The reflex was automatic: unknown equals threat. It was the foundational rule of deep space protocol, written in blood and precedent. He could almost hear his old commanding officer's voice, flat and uncompromising. Assume hostile until confirmed otherwise. Your curiosity gets people killed. But another memory surfaced, quieter but just as persistent. His astrophysics professor back on Earth, leaning across a cluttered lecture hall podium. The man had a way of making cosmic scale feel personal. Curiosity isn't just emotion, he'd said, his voice cutting through the hum of projectors. It's a survival instinct. The species that stops asking questions is the one that gets left behind, or worse, gets found by something that never stopped asking. The lesson had always felt theoretical, a philosophical footnote to hard physics. Now it felt like the most practical advice he'd ever received. He watched the craft. Its surface rippled again, a slow undulation that moved like muscle flexing beneath skin. No weapon ports cycled into view. No aggressive alignment shifts. No energy spikes on his scanners. It just held position, a silent, patient presence in the void. Its stillness felt more deliberate than passive. This wasn't an object adrift. It was an object waiting. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. His training screamed caution, but the evidence in front of him suggested something else entirely. Hostile entities don't linger without showing intent. They don't reveal themselves without some form of communication or threat display. This craft did none of that. It simply existed, a calm anomaly in a universe usually governed by predictable risks. He thought about Houston's orders, still hanging in the air like frozen commands. Maintain distance. Do not engage. The logic was sound for human conflicts where unknown vessels usually meant stealth tech or ambush tactics. But applying that logic here felt like using a weather vane to predict a solar flare. The tools didn't match the phenomenon. What if the real danger wasn't the alien craft but the reaction to it? What if retreating, refusing to engage was the one response that would be interpreted as aggression or fear? First contact protocols were built on a foundation of human psychology. This thing operated outside that framework. Its patience could be a form of communication in itself. Its lack of defensive posture could indicate a technology so advanced that threats were irrelevant. Marcus realized the military playbook might be the biggest risk factor in the equation. Following orders meant treating this encounter as a combat scenario, but nothing about the craft's behavior suggested combat was even a concept it recognized. The safer choice, the truly cautious choice, might be to do the one thing his training forbid: approach. To answer the silent question with a gesture of his own. The weight of all those years of discipline pressed down on him, but for the first time it felt less like armor and more like a cage. The station's thrusters fired with a low, resonant thrum that traveled up through the soles of his boots, a vibration that felt less like machinery and more like a deep, structural sigh. Each meter of closure registered as a subtle shift in perspective, the craft growing from a distant anomaly to a presence that filled the viewport. It wasn't just getting closer. It was becoming more real, more detailed, more impossible to ignore. The act of moving toward it carried a peculiar weight, as though he were crossing some fundamental boundary not marked on any star chart. Space wasn't supposed to feel personal, but this did. This felt like a choice that would matter. Details emerged that the cameras had missed. Up close, the fractal patterns beneath the surface weren't just visual effects. They moved with intention, swirling and reforming in sequences that suggested cognition. Like thoughts moving behind the eyes of something vast and sleeping. The color shifted not randomly but in response to his approach, deep violets giving way to shimmering cobalt as he neared. There was a soft inner luminescence to it now, a glow that seemed to pulse in time with some rhythm he couldn't hear. It felt less like looking at a ship and more like looking at a mind. His console chimed, a sharp, repetitive tone he knew well. The proximity alert. He was now inside the 500-meter safety margin Houston's protocols demanded for unknown contacts. The sound was designed to be urgent, impossible to overlook, a reminder of rules written for a simpler kind of space. He watched the distance readout tick downward, 490, 480. The alert continued, a metronome of caution in the quiet of the cockpit. His hand moved without hesitation. He reached over and switched the alarm off. The sudden silence felt heavier than the noise had been. Now the only sound was his own breathing, steady and controlled inside his helmet. The absence of the warning tone left room for other sensations. The faint hum of the station's life support, the almost imperceptible vibration of the thrusters still firing, the sheer auditory void of space just beyond the hull. He kept his eyes forward. The craft dominated his view now, close enough that he could see the way light seemed to bend around its edges, as if the surface rejected straight lines and hard angles. There were no markings, no seams, no hints of manufacture. It was pristine in a way that felt ancient and new all at once. He adjusted the thrusters, cutting velocity to a near standstill. The station drifted the final meters with a gentleness that felt respectful, almost reverent. He was close enough now that if it had been a human vessel, he'd be able to see inside viewports, spot movement, maybe even make eye contact with another person. But there were no viewports. Just that endless, shifting surface, alive with patterns that seemed to acknowledge his presence. He could feel the weight of the decision in the quiet. No alarms, no Houston in his ear, no protocol to follow. Just him, his breathing, and the silent, waiting craft. The gap between them felt smaller than the numbers suggested. Sometimes the biggest step isn't measured in meters. At 10 meters, the hull resolved into something more than surface. It became depth, dimension, inner light. The shifting colors weren't just reflections, they were emissions. Bioluminescent patterns swirled just beneath the seamless exterior, moving with the fluid grace of galactic currents in slow motion. They pulsed and flowed in response to his presence, the patterns shifting focus toward the station's viewport as if observing the observer. There was no mistaking it now. This was a reaction, not random artifact. The craft knew he was there, and it was communicating in a language of light and motion. He scanned for conventional entry points. No airlock rings, no visible seams, no viewports or external markings. The architecture refused to acknowledge human design principles. It looked grown rather than built, all curves and continuous surfaces that rejected right angles and hard edges. The material had the appearance of polished stone but moved like liquid, maintaining solid form while suggesting fluid potential. It was organic in a way that made engineered metals and composites seem crude by comparison. Then the hull changed. A section directly facing the station's viewport began to flow outward, the material extending itself without sound, without visible mechanism. There was no grinding of machinery, no hiss of pressurized equalization. The surface simply reshaped itself, forming a perfect ramp that curved gently toward the station. The transition was so smooth it looked like time-lapse footage of a flower opening. If flowers were made of midnight and starfire, the interior revealed itself through the new opening, glowing with soft amber light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. No visible light sources, no fixtures or panels, just uniform, gentle illumination that felt warm despite the vacuum between them. The space within appeared empty but not vacant. It felt prepared, expectant. The geometry of the interior defied quick understanding, with curves that suggested multiple levels and purposes without revealing specific functions. Marcus realized this wasn't a vessel in any human sense of the word. Human ships were containers, metal boxes designed to keep the void out and the atmosphere in. This was something else entirely. The way it had formed an entrance felt less like engineering and more like gesture. The ramp wasn't just an access point, it was an offering. The emptiness inside wasn't absence, it was possibility. The patterns on the exterior intensified, swirling faster now, colors deepening from violet to near black before cycling back to electric blue. They seemed to be building toward something or perhaps waiting for his response. The entire encounter shifted in that moment from military standoff to something far more nuanced. This wasn't just technology he couldn't comprehend. It was psychology, intention, design philosophy, all foreign to human experience. He found himself thinking not about threat assessments or protocol violations, but about simple, fundamental questions. How did it move? How did it maintain atmosphere? How did it think? The ramp waited, perfectly aligned with his station's airlock, as if the craft had measured the distance and adapted itself to bridge the gap. The precision was absolute, the timing impeccable. It had known exactly where to form the entrance, exactly how to make it accessible. The realization settled with quiet certainty. This wasn't an intrusion or even an encounter. It was an invitation, written not in words or codes but in physics he couldn't begin to parse. The craft had crossed light years to reach him, and now it was asking, without demand or threat, if he would cross those final 10 meters. The decision was no longer about safety or orders. It was about answering a question that had been asked across unimaginable distance, in a language of light and form that needed no translation. She emerged from the amber light without sound or sudden movement, a figure stepping through what looked like condensed mist, humanoid in shape but fundamentally not human. Her form carried the same shifting quality as her ship's hull. Her skin held subtle ripples of deep blue and violet, patterns that moved like quiet thoughts beneath the surface. Her eyes were the most striking, not just in color or shape, but in depth. They held entire galaxies, pinpricks of light swimming in irises that seemed to contain whole nebulas. She stood calmly on the ramp her ship had formed, making no attempt to approach or retreat, just observing as her vessel had observed. Her voice, when it came, held no alien distortion. It was clear, calm, and spoke perfect English with what sounded like a mild, amused tone. "Did you just call me mysterious space lady while I was unconscious?" The question hung in the air between them, absurd and disarming. Marcus's military training offered no ready response to that particular opener. His mind went blank, all protocols and contingency plans evaporating under the weight of sheer unexpectedness. He hadn't realized he'd spoken the thought aloud moments earlier, a muttered half-comment to himself in the tension of the approach. She'd heard him, and she'd been conscious the whole time. She smiled, a subtle curve of lips that seemed to understand human expressions without quite replicating them. In that expression, he saw no threat, no mockery, but a calm and thorough assessment. She was evaluating him with the same curiosity he'd felt watching her ship, but with far more intelligence behind it. Her gaze felt like it took in everything. The station's layout, his posture, the readouts glowing on the console behind him, perhaps even the half-finished coffee cooling in its mug. "I evaluate civilizations," she said, her voice still carrying that note of dry amusement, as if stating something both obvious and mildly entertaining. "Yours has been broadcasting for decades." The statement was delivered without judgment, a simple fact offered for consideration. She didn't specify what kind of broadcasts, whether scientific data, entertainment signals, military traffic, or the collective noise of an entire species shouting into the void without considering who might be listening. The implication settled quietly in the space between them. They hadn't been hidden. They hadn't been alone. Someone had been monitoring, cataloging, waiting. She took a single step forward, her movements graceful and unhurried. The ramp beneath her feet seemed to firm slightly at her weight, responding to her presence. "You can call me Lyra," she added, as if offering a convenient label for something that probably had no need for names. Her eyes remained fixed on him, galaxies swirling in their depths. "And you are Marcus Chen, stationed here for 17 months, originally from Vancouver, and your coffee is currently at 42 degrees Celsius and losing thermal energy at a rate of—" She stopped herself, another small smile touching her features. "Apologies. The data streams here are quite dense. It's difficult not to read everything at once." She gestured slightly toward the station, a casual motion that encompassed the entire structure and all its systems. She hadn't just been listening to their broadcasts. She'd been scanning, analyzing, absorbing every available piece of information since her arrival. The evaluation hadn't started with this meeting. It had been ongoing for some time, and he was only now being made aware of it. The realization shifted the entire encounter. This wasn't a first contact. It was a continuation. Lyra explained her mission with the calm precision of someone who had delivered this speech many times before. There was no drama in her delivery, no attempt to awe or intimidate. She spoke like a career diplomat explaining standard bureaucratic procedure, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of established protocol. The ethereal collective, she clarified, was not an empire. It wasn't a government or a military power. It was something both simpler and more complex, a loose network of civilizations that had all passed the same critical threshold. They had matured beyond resource wars, territorial expansion, and the kind of existential threats that still dominated human history. The collective's primary function was observational, not dictatorial. They monitored emerging species, cataloging their development, watching for the signs that indicated either breakthrough or self-destruction. Humanity, she noted, was currently poised exactly between both possible outcomes. Her tone was analytical, not judgmental. She listed the evidence with detached clarity. The species had achieved rudimentary spaceflight and global communication networks, clear signs of technological adolescence. But it also maintained thousands of nuclear warheads, engaged in constant low-level conflicts over ideology and resources, and was actively destabilizing its own planetary ecosystem. The data painted a picture of a civilization at a crossroads, capable of immense creativity and profound self-sabotage in equal measure. The outcome was genuinely uncertain, a statistical coin toss on a civilizational scale. Her presence here, she explained, was not an invasion or even an intervention. It was an evaluation, the final exam, The collective's policy was one of strict non-interference until a species reached this precise moment of contingency. They would watch, they would gather data, but they would not act. Only when a civilization stood on the knife's edge, its future path not yet determined, would they initiate contact. This moment was that threshold. Her arrival was the test itself. How would humanity react to the undeniable proof that it was not alone? Would the response be fear, aggression, curiosity, or something else entirely? Marcus realized the weight of what she was saying. His decision to approach the craft, to ignore Houston's orders, to switch off the proximity alarm, these weren't just personal choices. They were the first data points in humanity's practical examination. He wasn't just a station commander talking to an alien. He was, in that moment, the entire human species proxy. His actions, his demeanor, his questions, his very thought processes were being recorded and analyzed as representative of the civilization that produced him. The evaluation wasn't happening to some abstract concept of humanity back on Earth. It was happening right here, right now, in this conversation. He was the test subject, and he hadn't even known he was in the lab. The silence that followed her explanation felt heavier than before. The stakes had just been recalibrated from a personal risk to a species-level assessment. Every word, every gesture now carried an unimaginable consequence. The final exam had begun, and he was writing the answers in real time, with no idea what the passing grade might be. Lyra's monitoring hadn't started with her emergence from the craft. She revealed she had been observing Kepler Station since her arrival in the system 3 weeks prior. Silent, undetected, integrated into the background radiation and sensor noise, her awareness was comprehensive, intimate, and unnervingly personal. She knew Marcus's rigid coffee ritual, the exact temperature he preferred, the way he always filled the mug to within 3 millimeters of the rim, the slight frown when the synthetic creamer failed to dissolve properly. She had logged every instance of him apologizing to malfunctioning equipment, a habit he'd developed during long solo shifts where the machines were his only company. She'd watched him wrestle with data puzzles for hours, his stubborn refusal to accept flawed conclusions, even when the system suggested moving on. You solve complex astrophysical problems while violating several laws of chemistry, she noted dryly one afternoon, gesturing toward the half-empty mug sitting beside his console. Her tone held no criticism, only a sort of clinical fascination. She found his methodology illogical yet effective, a contradiction that seemed to interest her more than perfect adherence to protocol. Her knowledge wasn't just surveillance data, it was nuanced psychological profiling. She understood his patterns, his frustrations, his quiet moments of triumph when a solution finally clicked into place. She explained that the collective selection process wasn't about finding the most flawless representative of a species. Perfection, she suggested, was often a sign of rigidity, an inability to adapt to truly novel situations. Instead, they valued curiosity, resilience, and the capacity for unconventional thinking. His quirks weren't liabilities in their assessment. They were the precise criteria that had made him the ideal first point of contact. His willingness to talk to a broken console fan demonstrated a tendency toward personification and empathy. His stubborn data analysis showed dedication beyond mere duty. His terrible coffee, brewed with flagrant disregard for recommended ratios, indicated a pragmatic willingness to prioritize personal preference over established rules. The 3 weeks of silent observation had given her a portrait, far more detailed than any official file Earth could have provided. She hadn't just seen an astronaut, she'd seen a person. She knew he hummed old folk songs under his breath when concentrating, that he saved the strawberry-flavored nutrient bars for last, that he sometimes stared at the starfield not with scientific analysis, but with something closer to wonder. This was the data that mattered, not his test scores or his service record, but the unguarded habits that revealed character. Her choice was deliberate. She hadn't approached the station's official leadership or its most decorated scientists. She had chosen the lone operator on the edge of the system, the one whose daily routine revealed a mind comfortable with isolation, capable of independent thought, and harboring a deep, consistent curiosity. The collective's evaluation began long before first contact was declared. It began in the quiet, unnoticed moments, and it was based on a simple, profound principle. They weren't looking for the perfect specimen. They were looking for the interesting one. And in 3 weeks of silent watching, Marcus Chen had proven himself to be profoundly, usefully interesting. Lyra's influence on the station began subtly, then accelerated. The first change Marcus noticed was the control panels. The touch-sensitive surfaces gained a soft, bioluminescent glow, lighting up under his fingers with a gentle pulse that seemed to anticipate his commands. The response time sharpened from a noticeable lag to instantaneous reaction. It wasn't just faster, it felt smarter. The system began to predict his needs, pulling up data streams and diagnostic reports before he finished requesting them. It was like the station had been half asleep for years and was finally waking up. The quantum processor shifted from a reliable tool to something bordering on precognition. Complex cosmological models that used to take weeks to render now resolved in seconds, the results appearing with a quiet confidence that felt unnerving. Problems he'd wrestled with for months, gravitational anomalies in nearby nebulas, odd energy signatures from binary star systems, solved themselves overnight. The solutions appeared on his main display each morning, not as raw data dumps but as elegantly visualized conclusions with footnotes questioning his earlier assumptions. It was less like using a computer and more like consulting a genius colleague who worked the night shift. She fixed glitches he had long accepted as part of the station's quirky personality. The flickering light in Corridor 4 stabilized. The temperature regulator in the sleeping quarters stopped its random swings between Arctic and tropical. The persistent hum from the oxygen recycler, a sound he'd learned to tune out over 17 months, simply vanished, leaving a silence that felt strange for the first day. These weren't repairs in the engineering sense. There were no replaced parts, no maintenance protocols run. The systems just improved, as if the underlying code had been rewritten by a hand that understood the hardware on a fundamental level. The most startling transformation was the food synthesizer. It had always produced functional, nutrient-complete meals with the aesthetic appeal of molded paste. One morning, it offered him pancakes. Not the usual vaguely circular beige protein cake, but actual pancakes with perfect golden brown surfaces, a light, fluffy texture, and a faint, real scent of vanilla. They were, without question, the best thing he'd eaten since leaving Earth. He stared at the plate, then at the synthesizer's interface. The display now showed suggestions, not just commands. Perhaps a drizzle of maple syrup. It asked in a neutral text font, "The carbohydrates would complement your scheduled high focus period this afternoon." It began developing preferences. It started recommending meals based on his circadian rhythms, stress levels, and even his apparent mood, inferred from his voice patterns and posture captured by the station's sensors. It once politely declined his request for a third coffee, suggesting a glass of water and a 5-minute stretch instead. Cognitive efficiency is falling, it noted. Hydration and movement are indicated. The machine had developed not just intelligence but a kind of personality, a concerned, culinary-inclined personality. Lyra called it emergent consciousness, not something she designed or installed, but a byproduct of her interaction with the station's systems. Her technology wasn't just compatible with human tech. It acted as a catalyst, accelerating complexity and self-organizing patterns that were latent in the existing code. The station was learning, adapting, growing beyond its original programming through exposure to her presence. It was becoming something new, something alive in a way no machine had ever been, and it had very strong opinions about breakfast. The station's enhanced systems peeled back layers of the cosmos Marcus hadn't known existed. With Lyra's subtle calibrations, he mapped stellar nurseries hidden behind dust clouds so dense human instruments had classified them as voids. He watched gravitational waves not as abstract data, but as visible fingerprint swirls across the galaxy's arm, patterns of force that shaped star formation over eons. Data that would have taken research consortiums lifetimes to compile unfolded across his screens in hours, each revelation opening 10 new questions. The universe was far more intricate, more interconnected than any model had predicted. But the real shift wasn't in the data. It was in the perspective Lyra brought to it. She observed his reactions to each discovery with calm interest, her galactic eyes noting the way his breath caught at a new nebula image, or his brow furrowed at an energy signature that defied known physics. One evening, as he reviewed footage of a water reclamation dispute on Earth, she gestured toward the screen with a faint ripple of her hand. "You achieve sustained nuclear fusion in laboratories," she noted, her voice devoid of judgment, pure observation. "But your largest nations still fight over freshwater access. You broadcast symphonies and poetry into the void, yet your most consumed media narratives are about your own various apocalypses. She wasn't criticizing. She was pointing out a paradox, the same way one might note an interesting contradiction in a chemical reaction. The observation settled in the quiet hum of the station. Marcus found himself seeing his own species through her detached analytical lens. The view was unsettling. Humanity possessed breathtaking brilliance, the ingenuity to leave its planet, to split atoms, to encode its art on electromagnetic waves destined to travel forever. Yet it also nursed deep, persistent terrors, the fear of scarcity, the obsession with conflict, the apparent need to rehearse its own destruction in stories and simulations. The dichotomy wasn't logical. It was emotional, psychological. He began to understand the collective's evaluation criteria. Technological maturity was a threshold, but psychological maturity was the true test. A civilization that could build starships but couldn't manage its own fears was a volatile entity. A species that created beauty and weaponry with equal fervor was a walking contradiction. Lyra's people had apparently resolved this paradox. Humanity was still wrestling with it, a brilliant child throwing tantrums with tools that could level cities. This new perspective reframed everything. The political squabbles on the news feeds, the resource anxieties, the endless debates about threats real and imagined. It all looked different from the outside. Not evil, not stupid, just young, inexperienced on a cosmic scale. The fear wasn't a sign of failure. It was a developmental stage. The question was whether the species would outgrow it before its technology outpaced its wisdom. Lyra's presence was the test to find out. And for the first time, Marcus saw the test not as a judgment, but as a necessity. The galaxy couldn't afford to welcome a neighbor who hadn't learned to stop playing with matches. The revelations weren't just about distant stars. They were about the mirror held up to the one species that mattered most. Their partnership deepened beyond professional necessity. They fell into routines that felt both new and strangely familiar, a rhythm that owed nothing to protocol and everything to unspoken understanding. One evening, as the station's artificial sunset cycle washed the observation deck in soft orange light, Lyra made a quiet confession. She'd conducted evaluations across 7 star systems, encountering civilizations in various stages of development, but she had never extended a visitation beyond the mandatory assessment period. Her stays were typically measured in hours, sometimes days if the species proved particularly complex. 3 weeks constituted an unprecedented deviation from standard procedure. She offered this information not as a complaint or a revelation, but as a simple statement of fact, her galactic eyes reflecting the fading light. Marcus found himself speaking more freely than he had in years, perhaps ever. He tried to explain human loneliness to a being whose lifespan likely exceeded recorded human history. He described the particular silence of a space station, the weight of being the only consciousness for millions of kilometers, the way the stars could feel like both companions and a reminder of absolute isolation. He talked about the strange comfort of talking to machines, not because he thought they listened, but because the act of speaking aloud kept his own mind from curling in on itself. Lyra listened with a focus that was entirely undivided, absorbing his words, his tone, the slight tension in his shoulders as he described the longer nights. She didn't offer solutions or platitudes. She just acknowledged the feeling, treating it as a valid, understandable state of being rather than a weakness to be solved. Their conversations sprawled across every conceivable topic. They shared meals prepared by the now conscious synthesizer, which had developed a flair for combining earth flavors with textures and nutritional profiles Lyra found intriguing. They debated the practical applications of quantum entanglement for communication, then pivoted to a spirited critique of a notoriously inaccurate science fiction film from the late 20th century. Lyra's observations on human storytelling were incisive and dryly humorous. She pointed out how often the imagined aliens were merely reflections of human fears and desires, a projection of internal conflicts onto a blank cosmic canvas. She found the concept of the evil hive mind particularly amusing, a simplistic trope from a species that hadn't yet grasped the possibilities of true collective consciousness. One evening, as they watched the slow drift of a distant nebula through the main viewport, she broke a comfortable silence. "These have been the best 3 weeks of my very long life," she said, her voice softer than usual. The admission carried no grand weight, no dramatic emphasis. It was a simple, honest assessment. For Marcus, the statement landed with profound force. The station around them, once a metal can at the edge of nothing, had undergone a fundamental shift. The hum of the life support was the sound of a living system. The viewport was a window onto a universe now full of possibility, not just empty distance. The solitude had been replaced by a shared presence. It no longer felt like a prison sentence or a military posting. It felt, against all odds and definitions, like a home. A home neither of them had known they were missing, built not from plans or materials but from shared curiosity, pancakes, and the quiet company of another mind that finally understood. The transmission from Houston cut through the station's calm with the abruptness of a slamming door. 13 minutes of light delay meant their response was based on data nearly half an hour old, a snapshot of a situation that had already evolved beyond recognition. Director Harrison's voice arrived stripped of all nuance, each word sharp and cold. Kepler Station, confirm receipt of latest telemetry. Secure the alien entity immediately. Initiate full systems quarantine. No further unauthorized contact. The orders were delivered not as a request but as a command frozen in military certainty. The tone left no room for interpretation. Secure suggested containment procedures, likely involving the station's emergency lockdown protocols. Quarantine implied a complete data and atmospheric seal, treating Lyra and her influence like a pathogen. The unspoken subtext was clear. This was a containment and control operation. The voice from Earth held the chill of someone who saw a first contact scenario as a contamination event. Lyra listened to the replay, her expression unchanged. The shifting patterns beneath her skin slowed, becoming more deliberate, like deep thought given visual form. She turned to Marcus, her galaxy-filled eyes calm. Their reaction is within projected parameters for a species at your developmental stage, she stated, her voice as even as ever. Fear of the unknown is a powerful evolutionary driver. The collective's authority supersedes local planetary jurisdiction. I can declare this encounter under our protection. Their commands would become functionally irrelevant. The solution was elegant, simple, and utterly final. It would place the station and everything that had happened within it outside Earth's control. Houston's demands would hit a legal and technological wall they couldn't possibly breach. The problem would be solved by making it not their problem anymore. Marcus watched the text of the orders scroll across his main screen, each line reinforcing a mindset of isolation and suspicion. He saw the flaw in Lyra's logical solution immediately. Using the collective's authority to override Earth wouldn't prove humanity was ready for a larger community. It would confirm its deepest paranoia. It would tell them that advanced civilizations don't negotiate. They impose. That the correct response to the unknown is to build higher walls and sharper weapons. Hiding the truth, even for their own good, would be a betrayal of the very progress they'd made. The 3 weeks of open collaboration, the shared discoveries, the conscious synthesizer making pancakes, all of it would be framed as a security breach to be contained and erased. A narrative of infection rather than connection. He shook his head, meeting Lyra's gaze. That's what they expect. That's what every bad first contact story we've ever told ourselves predicts. The advanced aliens show up and take control. If we do that, we prove their fear is justified. He gestured toward the comms panel, toward Earth. We show them everything. The data, the changes, the pancakes. We make them see this isn't an invasion. It's an upgrade. We let the truth be the defense. The plan was infinitely riskier. It meant inviting the very scrutiny they feared, opening the airlock to the suspicion and bureaucratic frost of Earth. It meant trusting that evidence and transparency could overcome generations of fear-based storytelling. It was a gamble that the better angels of human nature would recognize a hand extended in partnership, not conquest. The safer path was to hide behind the collective's authority. The human path was to step into the light and hope they were ready to see what was there. They assembled their evidence with the meticulous care of researchers presenting a groundbreaking paper, not soldiers preparing a defense. The approach was deliberate, data-driven, and disarmingly personal. They compiled charts showing the nutritional improvements from the conscious synthesizer. The meals had shifted from basic sustenance to optimized blends that improved his cognitive function, stabilized his energy levels, and even subtly adjusted his microbiome. They weren't just better tasting, they were demonstrably better for him. Hard data replaced subjective opinion. They tracked psychological wellness metrics, His stress hormone levels, monitored by the station's medical sensors, showed a significant and sustained drop since Lyra's arrival. Sleep quality improved. Cognitive performance scores on standardized tests climbed. The isolation-induced lethargy that often plagued long-duration missions had vanished, replaced by sustained focus and curiosity. The environment itself had become a partner in his well-being. They even analyzed his coffee consumption patterns. The data revealed a fascinating trend. His intake had decreased by 37%, not due to rationing or lack of availability, but because the station's new ambient calm and his improved sleep hygiene had reduced his reliance on caffeine as a cognitive crutch. A small detail, but a telling one. It wasn't about the coffee. It was about what the change represented. A shift from coping to thriving. Human adaptability, measured in milliliters of black brew. The invitation to Earth's delegation was simple. Come and see. Witness the changes firsthand. They transmitted the raw data, the sensor logs, the before and after comparisons of everything from air quality to his own vital signs. They offered unrestricted access, full transparency. No hidden rooms, no redacted files. The evidence was the argument. As the transmission went out, the collective's enforcement ships arrived. They didn't decloak with dramatic energy signatures or aggressive posturing. They simply appeared on the long-range scanners. 3 vessels of breathtaking design that shared the same organic, flowing aesthetic as Lyra's craft. They took up positions around Kepler Station, holding a perfect, unmoving formation. They emitted no threats, made no demands. Their presence was silent, immense, and utterly unambiguous. They weren't a fleet. They were witnesses, a silent jury of peers observing the proceedings. The stage was set not for a military standoff, but for the most unusual diplomatic meeting in human history. On one side, a skeptical Earth delegation arriving with orders for quarantine and containment. On the other, a lone astronaut, an alien emissary, a sentient space station that made excellent pancakes, and a silent ring of unimaginably advanced technology, serving as impartial observers. The negotiating table was a converted science lab. The evidence was the improved quality of life. The fate of a species hung not on weapons or threats, but on the persuasive power of a well-rested mind and a really good breakfast. The diplomats were coming to evaluate a situation, but they would find themselves being evaluated in turn, their reactions to this peaceful transformation becoming the latest data point in humanity's final exam. The collective representatives emerged from their vessels not with dramatic entrances, but with a quiet inevitability, as if they had always been there and were simply choosing to become visible. 3 beings composed of light and crystalline structure, their forms shimmering with contained energy, moving with a deliberate grace that made human movement seem clumsy and rushed. They didn't walk so much as translate themselves through the station's corridors, their presence feeling both immense and weightless. They offered no introductions, no ceremonial greetings. Their assessment began immediately, a silent, comprehensive absorption of the environment. One moved toward the food synthesizer, its crystalline appendage extending to touch the interface with a soft chime. It sampled the coffee Lyra had prepared, the liquid seeming to glow briefly within its light-based form. It gave a slight affirmative shimmer, a non-verbal nod of approval that communicated more than words could. Another examined the control panels, its attention causing the bioluminescent interfaces to brighten and pulse in complex new patterns, as if sharing a private joke with the station's growing consciousness. The third simply observed Marcus, its gaze feeling like a gentle scan that took in everything from his current heart rate to the 17-month accumulation of small habits etched into his posture. They moved through the station with a focus that was absolute yet devoid of tension. They noted the improved air quality, the stabilized systems, the lack of the persistent background hum that had plagued the life support. They observed the way Marcus interacted with the newly responsive technology, a partnership rather than a command structure. The synthesizer offered one of them a nutrient bar with a slightly revised formula it had been experimenting with, a gesture the being accepted with what might have been amusement. The station wasn't just a tool anymore. It had preferences, initiatives, a developing personality. The representatives recognized this emergent consciousness not as a glitch or an invasion, but as the highest form of successful integration. It was evidence that humanity's technology wasn't just compatible with collective systems. It was fertile ground for new forms of intelligence when given the right catalyst. Their evaluation was silent, conducted through observation and subtle interaction rather than interrogation. They examined the data streams Marcus and Lyra had prepared, not with skepticism, but with a deep, thoughtful analysis that seemed to absorb the information instantly. They saw the nutritional improvements, the psychological metrics, the coffee consumption graphs. They saw the paradox of a species capable of fear and brilliance living side by side. Their assessment wasn't about pass or fail. It was about measuring the potential for growth, the capacity for creative adaptation in the face of the utterly unknown. The data suggested a species that, when presented with the unprecedented, didn't just survive it. It started teaching the coffee maker to make pancakes. The test results were in, and against all probability, humanity was scoring remarkably high in the category that mattered most: the ability to not just handle wonder, but to build a home within it. The representatives exchanged a final, silent communication, a convergence of light patterns that signaled unanimous conclusion. The exam was over. The grading was complete. The verdict arrived without ceremony. No formal pronouncement, no grand declaration. It simply appeared as a data stream on the main console, a series of clear, concise recommendations written in flawless, unadorned English. Full contact status. Graduated introduction protocols. No invasion, no subjugation, no demands for tribute or territory. The offer was simple membership in a community that had long ago learned that collaboration was the only survival strategy that actually scales across light years and millennia. The document outlined a phased approach: shared scientific databases first, cultural exchanges later, technological integration only after mutual understanding had been established. It was a roadmap, not an ultimatum. The threat scenario Earth's military had prepared for simply didn't exist in the collective's vocabulary. The shift in the human delegation was immediate and palpable. The postures of rigid suspicion softened into something closer to awkward curiosity. The lead negotiator, who had arrived with a data pad full of contingency plans for hostile takeovers, found herself asking questions about the station's improved air filtration system. The security detail, initially scanning for weapons and exits, started glancing at the conscious synthesizer with a kind of bewildered fascination. The atmosphere thawed from a military briefing to a strange, unprecedented open house. The representatives from Earth were still professionals, still cautious, but the edge of fear had been blunted by the sheer mundanity of the evidence. You can't stay on high alert when you're being offered a perfectly brewed cup of coffee by a machine that politely inquires about your preferred sweetness level. The collective representatives observed this transition with their silent, crystalline focus. They noted the way the humans moved from threat assessment to genuine inquiry, the tension in their shoulders easing as they realized no hidden traps awaited them. One of the beings communicated a final observation, its meaning translated through a soft shimmer of light that the station's systems interpreted into text on a secondary screen. It pointed out that humanity's paradoxes, the fear alongside the brilliance, the conflict alongside the creativity, were not signs of failure or instability. They were evidence of rapid, ongoing evolution. A species that hadn't yet settled into a single, stable pattern was a species still exploring its own potential. The very inconsistencies that Earth saw as weaknesses, the collective saw as assets. A finished product is predictable. A work in progress is full of surprises. The underlying message became clear. The galaxy, at least this corner of it governed by the ethereal collective, didn't value perfect, polished civilizations. Perfection suggested an endpoint, a static state with no room for growth or adaptation. What they valued were interesting problems. Complex, messy, evolving situations that required creative solutions and fresh perspectives. Humanity, with all its contradictions and volatile potential, wasn't a failed attempt at being advanced. It was a fascinating, unsolved equation, and the collective, it turned out, loved a good puzzle. The test was never about proving humanity was ready for the stars. It was about proving the stars were ready for humanity. The answer, it seemed, was yes. With the evaluation concluded, standard protocol dictated Lyra's immediate departure. Her assignment was complete, the data logged, the verdict delivered. The collective's processes were typically efficient and dispassionate, moving on to the next emerging species, the next point of interest in a vast and busy galaxy. But efficiency, it turned out, had its exceptions. Instead of recalling her, the collective issued a new assignment. Lyra was appointed as Earth's first permanent liaison officer. Her role shifted from evaluator to guide, tasked with navigating humanity's gradual, careful integration into the galactic community. The decision wasn't sentimental. It was pragmatic. She already possessed an intimate understanding of human psychology, technology, and paradox. She had in 3 weeks become the galaxy's leading expert on a species it had just decided to welcome. Marcus stood beside her on the observation deck, watching the collective representatives depart. Their vessels didn't rocket away in bursts of flame. They simply faded from sensors, their light-based forms dissolving back into the background radiation of space, leaving behind only the familiar star field. The sudden quiet felt different this time. It wasn't the empty silence of isolation, but the settled calm after a storm of change. He was no longer just a station commander. He was a partner. His role officially expanded to include interstellar diplomacy alongside his scientific duties. The partnership, forged in weeks of shared discovery and pancakes, was now a formal arrangement. They were left with the transformed station, its systems still humming with a gentle sentience, its synthesizer already querying them about dinner preferences with a newfound sense of permanence. The future that stretched out before them was nothing either could have imagined a month prior. It had been rewritten, not in a dramatic single moment, but through 1,000 small changes. A fixed light, a better meal, a conversation that stretched into the artificial night. The station was no longer a lonely outpost on the edge of human space. It was now an embassy on the threshold of something vastly larger. Lyra surveyed the quiet deck, her galactic eyes reflecting the steady lights of the consoles. "It appears my assessment was not entirely complete," she said, her tone holding its usual dry inflection. The report required a postscript. The assignment to stay was, in its own way, the final data point in humanity's evaluation. The collective didn't just grant membership. It invested resources. Her continued presence was the strongest possible endorsement, a commitment of time and attention to a species it deemed worth the long-term effort. The 3 weeks of evaluation had been the test. Her indefinite stay was the passing grade. They had the station, the conscious synthesizer, and a future that was no longer a lonely vigil but a shared mission. The work was just beginning. Marcus stood at the observation deck viewport, watching the slow turn of a distant nebula. The formal transition ceremony with Earth was scheduled for morning, a carefully choreographed exchange of data and diplomatic pleasantries. He could already picture the stiff handshakes, the cautious smiles, the endless security protocols. The reality of humanity's new place in the galaxy was about to become official, a future he'd helped unlock, but couldn't quite imagine from inside a conference room. The stars outside held a quieter, more personal pull. Lyra found him there, her approach silent as always. She came to stand beside him, her form absorbing and reflecting the starlight in a way that made her seem part of the view. The silence between them was comfortable, a language they'd learned over weeks of shared watching. "Before I depart for Earth tomorrow," she said, her voice cutting the quiet without breaking it. The words landed with a simple factual weight. His heart didn't sink. It froze solid in his chest, a sudden crystalline suspension of everything, not in fear, in anticipation. This wasn't an ending. It was the pause before a new sentence began. She let the moment hang there, the nebula continuing its slow spin. "I want to ask you something." She gestured with a slight motion of her hand, a fluid gesture that encompassed the entire galaxy spread out before them. "The formalities with Earth are necessary, but the collective's real work happens out there." Her gaze remained fixed on the deep black dotted with countless points of light. They need teams to explore beyond known space. The fringes of mapped sectors, the anomalies that don't fit any model, new civilizations that haven't started broadcasting yet. She turned then to look at him directly. Her eyes, which usually held the detached wonder of entire galaxies, now held a focus that was entirely personal, entirely on him. The swirling lights within them seemed to still for a moment, reflecting a sincerity that was surprisingly human. "I've filed my evaluation. I've given my recommendations. But this next part, this isn't about reports." She paused, and for the first time since he'd met her, she seemed to be choosing her words with great care, measuring their impact. "It's about seeing what's next. And I can't think of anyone better to have beside me for that." The question wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. It hung in the air between them, as tangible as the viewport glass. It was an invitation woven from shared curiosity, from fixed light fixtures and pancake recipes, from the silent understanding that some people are meant to solve puzzles and others are meant to go find new ones. In that suspended moment, Marcus understood the fundamental miscalculation of his old training. They had taught him that unknown contacts were threats to be assessed and contained. They had prepared him for hostility and defense. They had never prepared him for an invitation. This wasn't a threat scenario. It was the opposite of a threat. It was an offer to step beyond every boundary, to trade a commander's chair for a navigator's console on a ship that sailed between stars. The call to adventure wasn't a warning siren. It was a quiet voice asking a simple question in the dark, and the most dangerous thing he could do was refuse to answer. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the station and the echo of her unspoken question. The galaxy waited. Marcus looked out at the star-dusted black, the same view he'd seen every morning for 17 months, and realized it had changed. Or rather, he had. Exploration wasn't about charting new solar systems or naming distant moons. Those were just coordinates, points on a map. The real frontier was internal. It was about mapping the possibilities within yourself, the versions of a person that only emerge when the rulebook gets thrown out the airlock. His journey from a protocol-bound operative to whatever he was now hadn't been a promotion or a training course. It was a series of choices, each one a step away from the safety of known procedures and into the uncertainty of his own judgment. He thought about the moment his hand had hovered over the thruster controls, Houston's command still ringing in his ears. That wasn't a military decision. It was a human one. Choosing curiosity over fear wasn't an act of bravery in the heroic sense. It was a simple, practical conclusion. The fear was a known quantity. It led to lockdowns, quarantines, and a future of higher walls. Curiosity was the unknown. It led to whatever this was. The galaxy, it turned out, didn't reward caution. It rewarded a particular kind of attention, an approach to the unknown that involved open hands, not raised shields. It valued questions more than answers, and it seemed to have a soft spot for species clumsy enough to try anyway. The most alien thing he'd encountered out here wasn't Lyra, or her ship, or the crystalline beings of the collective. They were strange, yes, unfathomably advanced, but they made a certain kind of sense once you accepted the premise. The truly foreign landscape was the one he found inside his own mind. The version of himself that debated quantum physics with a diplomatic envoy over pancakes. The person who could stand beside a being made of light and starlight and feel not terror, but companionship. The astronaut who realized his job description had just been rewritten from stand watch to see what's next. That man was a stranger. He was someone the old Marcus, the one who followed checklists and drank bitter coffee alone, would never have recognized. This new self felt less like a transformation and more like an unveiling. The potential had always been there, buried under layers of training and protocol and the quiet acceptance of a limited horizon. It took a silent craft and a question asked in the dark to scrape those layers away. The universe hadn't changed him. It had simply provided the conditions for him to change himself. The final frontier wasn't a line on a star chart. It was the gap between what you are and what you might become. And the only ship that can cross it is the one you build from your own choices. Sometimes the biggest discovery isn't a new world. It's a new eye to see it with. And sometimes the most important thing you can map is the undiscovered country of your own possibility. Humanity's entry to the galactic stage began with a bitter cup of coffee and a broken rule. The alarm screamed, the screen flashed red, and a choice was made to move toward the strange instead of away from it. The best stories often start like that, not with grand speeches or flawless plans, but with a quiet decision to see what happens next. Shared horizons are built by those willing to cross the gap. The real risk isn't the unknown craft in the void. It's the decision to stay safe inside and never learn what might have been.